What happens when a man who believes his wealth makes him a god tries to crush a woman who finds her strength in the ancient, unyielding words of her ancestors? In the heart of Chicago, within the hushed, velvet-lined walls of Aurelia, a restaurant where reservations are a form of currency, a young scholar named Layla was about to discover the answer. She was simply trying to keep her world from collapsing. He was Alistair Finch, a private equity predator, a name synonymous with ruthless efficiency and the brutal dismantling of legacy companies. That evening, he saw her as nothing more than a transient shadow, a functional part of the five-star decor. To entertain his guest, he uttered a string of cruelties in the sharp, guttural Arabic of the boardroom, utterly blind to the secret she held within her. He called her a girl of the desert with a mind full of sand. He was about to learn that this desert girl's soul was an ancient library, and her words, drawn from the ink of poets and prophets, could fracture his glass and steel world in ways his billions never could. The very air inside Aurelia was a commodity, filtered, cooled to a precise 68 degrees, and scented with a bespoke blend of white tea and old money. For Layla Hassan, a 23-year-old PhD candidate in Semitic languages and philology, it was an alien atmosphere she endured 5 nights a week. Each shift, she would tie the crisp linen apron over her simple black uniform, a symbolic shedding of her academic self. She would step away from the fragile, 1,000-year-old vellum of her dissertation research and into the role of an attentive, invisible servant, a ghost who refilled glasses of Sancerre and cleared away the remnants of meticulously constructed meals. Aurelia was more than a job. It was a grim necessity. The tips, which often exceeded a professor's weekly salary in a single night, were the only thing standing between her father and the unforgiving reality of the American healthcare system. Her father, Dr. Omar Hassan, had once been a titan in his own right, a celebrated historian and the leading authority on early Islamic calligraphy. His mind, a treasure trove of forgotten dialects and intricate histories, was now a fractured landscape, ravaged by a massive stroke that had left him partially paralyzed and trapped in the fog of aphasia. The cost of his specialized care at the Lakeshore Neurological Institute was a relentless, crushing weight, and Aurelia, with its clientele of billionaires and hedge fund managers, was the only place she could earn enough to bear it. Layla was a master of her temporary craft. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, a quiet efficiency that bordered on prescience. A guest glance towards the water pitcher would find her already there, bottle in hand. She anticipated the need for a fresh fork, the desire for another pat of butter, the subtle signal that a conversation was private and she should momentarily disappear. Her professional demeanor was a carefully constructed fortress, polished and impenetrable. Most of the patrons saw only the fortress, the function, never the woman within. They saw an instrument of service, and Layla preferred it that way. In anonymity, there was a kind of peace. Her hidden weapon, the skill that would never appear on a line cook's resume, was her mastery of Arabic. It was more than fluency. It was the language of her soul. The daughter of a Jordanian academic and an American mother, she had grown up in a house where classical Arabic was spoken as often as English. Her father hadn't just taught her the language. He had taught her its poetry, its history, its profound and intricate beauty. He would spend hours with her, tracing the elegant, Kufic script of ancient Qurans, his voice a low, reverent murmur as he explained the layers of meaning in a single, perfectly formed letter. She could not only speak the language of modern Amman, but could also read and understand the dense literary Arabic of Al-Jahiz in the soaring verses of Al-Mutanabi. At Aurelia, this profound knowledge was a silent, secret observation deck. She understood the hushed business dealings of Saudi princes, the flirtatious whispers of Lebanese tourists, and the homesick complaints of Emirati businessmen. She never revealed her understanding. To be underestimated was to be safe. Tonight, however, the atmosphere in Aurelia felt different, stretched taut with a palpable tension. The reservation was under a single name, Finch. One word, but it was enough to send a current of apprehension through the entire staff. Alistair Finch was not merely wealthy, he was a force of nature, a corporate hurricane known for acquiring companies, gutting them for their most valuable assets, and casting aside the husks, leaving thousands jobless in his wake. His firm, Finch Equity Partners, was a black hole of capital. He was infamous for his volcanic temper and for treating service staff as subhuman. Table 12 is Finch, Julian the maitre d' hissed, his normally placid face tight with anxiety. Layla, you're up. You're the only one who doesn't crack under pressure. Layla gave a crisp, professional nod, her expression unreadable. Of course, Julian. Inside, a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. It wasn't fear, but a weary resignation. Men like Finch viewed the world as a chessboard where they were the only player, and everyone else was a pawn to be sacrificed. She took a deep, calming breath, picturing the steady hand of her father guiding a reed pen over paper. She composed her features into a serene, professional mask and approached the corner booth where two men were settling in. One was older, with a gentle, scholarly air about him, his tweed jacket a stark contrast to the sharp Italian suit of his companion. The other was Alistair Finch. He was handsome in a way that was almost violent, all sharp angles and cold, piercing blue eyes. His hair was the color of iron, styled with brutal precision. His gaze swept the room with an air of bored possession, cataloging, assessing, and dismissing everything he saw. He did not acknowledge Layla's presence as she approached, his attention fixed on his companion. "Good evening, gentlemen," Layla said, her voice a calm, low melody. "Welcome to Aurelia. May I start you with something from the bar? Or perhaps some water for the table?" Finch didn't even glance at her. He made a curt, dismissive gesture with his hand, a flick of the wrist that meant, "You are an interruption. Disappear." The older man, however, offered her a small, apologetic smile. He had kind eyes that seemed to hold a deep, scholarly wisdom. "Still water for me, please, my dear," he said, his voice a warm, cultured baritone. "And Alistair, are you having your usual?" "A Macallan 25, neat," Finch snapped, not to Layla, but in her general direction, his focus still on his guest. "And don't take all night about it." "Of course, sir," Layla replied, her polite smile firmly in place. The older gentleman gave her another brief, sympathetic look as she turned to leave. He seemed embarrassed by his companion's boorishness. Layla had already pieced together the dynamic. The older man was Dr. Elias Vance, the esteemed curator of the Near East Antiquities collection at the Field Museum. Finch, a new trustee, was trying to strong-arm him into supporting a controversial plan to deaccession several minor artifacts to fund a new, gleaming, and very prominently named Finch Technology Wing. Finch was the predator. Dr. Vance was the reluctant gatekeeper. As she returned with the drinks, Finch was mid-sentence. "Elias, you're thinking like a historian. I'm thinking like a businessman. These minor artifacts are just dusty pots taking up space in your basement. My way, you get a state-of-the-art interactive exhibit, and I get a tasteful legacy." "History is not a balance sheet, Alistair," Dr. Vance said gently. "Every pot, every shard, tells a story." Finch scoffed, finally turning his cold eyes on Layla as she placed his scotch before him. He stared at her for a moment, his gaze clinical and dismissive, as if she were a piece of tableware. "Tell us, waitress," he said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "What's your story? Did you come here for a better life, hoping to marry a rich man?" The question was designed to humiliate, to put her in her place. Layla felt a surge of heat in her cheeks but kept her voice even. "I'm a student, sir. I'm here to pay for my father's medical care." Finch let out a short, humorless laugh. "A student? How noble." He took a sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving hers. "Well, tonight, your job is to be invisible. Understand?" "Perfectly, sir," she said, her smile unwavering. She retreated from the table, her back ramrod straight. The battle lines had been drawn. She didn't realize it then, but this was not just a battle for her dignity. It was a confrontation that would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare, with Layla as the unwilling collateral damage. She performed her duties with flawless, balletic grace. The wine, a ridiculously expensive Chateau Margaux, was presented and decanted perfectly. The bread, a warm, crusty sourdough from a local artisan bakery, was replenished without a sound. But Alistair Finch was on a mission to assert his dominance over every aspect of his environment, and Layla was the most convenient target. He was performing for Dr. Vance, attempting to project an aura of absolute power, a man for whom the world bent to his will. When Layla took their order, he critiqued her pronunciation of bouillabaisse. When she served the appetizers, he claimed his seared scallops were a degree too cool, though she had carried them directly from the pass. Each time she would respond with a quiet, unassailable politeness. "I will inform the chef immediately, sir. My apologies, sir." Her placid composure seemed to enrage him more than any argument ever could. He was a man who fed on reactions, on fear, on anger, on flustered apologies. Her professional neutrality was a smooth, polished wall he couldn't find a foothold on, and it was driving him to distraction. She moved about the table, a silent observer, clearing plates, refilling glasses, and all the while she listened. Her academic ear, trained to discern the subtle shifts in dialect and meaning, picked up every nuance. Finch was becoming increasingly aggressive, belittling Dr. Vance's sentimental attachment to his collection, pushing him to see the bigger picture, a picture that prominently featured the Finch name carved in granite. Dr. Vance, for his part, parried with quiet dignity and unshakable conviction. The main courses arrived, a delicate Dover sole for Dr. Vance and a massive bone-in ribeye for Finch. As Layla set the heavy plate before him, the cuff of her sleeve made the slightest, whisper-light contact with his forearm. It was nothing, a fleeting brush of fabric, but Finch recoiled as if she had struck him with a hot poker. "For God's sake, watch yourself," he snarled, his voice a low, venomous whip-crack. "My sincerest apologies, sir," Layla said, taking a step back. This was it. He had had enough of her unbreakable poise. He wanted to see her crumble. He wanted to demonstrate to the learned Dr. Vance that everyone, from scholars to waitresses, could be broken and categorized. He turned to Dr. Vance, a conspiratorial smirk twisting his features, and switched to Arabic. He made the common, arrogant assumption of the monolingual, powerful, that the help were deaf and dumb to any language but their own. His Arabic was fluent but brutal, the dialect of international finance, stripped of all poetry and grace. It was a language learned for transactions, not for connection. "Unzur ila fatat al-badia hadihi," he began, gesturing toward Layla with his steak knife, the gesture itself an act of casual violence. "Look at this little desert girl." Layla, who had turned to leave, froze mid-step. The phrase, "fatat al-badia," struck her like a physical blow. It was a loaded, condescending term, implying she was an uneducated Bedouin, a primitive. It was an insult her father had heard whispered in the snobbish academic circles of Europe. Finch, emboldened by Dr. Vance's shocked silence, which he misinterpreted as awe at his audacity rather than disgust at his cruelty, pressed on. He leaned toward the older man, his voice a low, grating rasp. "Tatakid anaha shay'un biwajhiha al-jadhada, lakin aqliha ram. Qasaman hiya la ta'rif man nahnu hatta." She thinks she is something with that serious face of hers, but her mind is sand. I swear she doesn't even know who we are. The insult was a poisoned dart, aimed not just at her intelligence, but at her very identity. He had erased her, dismissed her as a hollow vessel, an empty-headed desert girl whose sole purpose was to serve him. Her mind is sand. Every nerve in Layla's body screamed. The years of her father's patient teaching, the nights spent poring over complex grammatical treatises, the love for a language so rich and deep it held the history of civilizations within its verses. All of it was being desecrated by this hollow man who used its words as blunt instruments. The weight of her father's illness, the crushing responsibility, the constant need to swallow her pride and smile through clenched teeth, it all reached a critical mass. She could let it pass. She could walk away, and he would remain ignorant in his smug superiority. She could save her job, pay the next month's bill for the institute, and choke down the bitterness of his words. It was the sensible choice. But then an image flashed in her mind. Her father, before the stroke, his eyes alight with intellectual fire as he recited a verse from the 10th century poet Al-Mutanabi. She could hear his voice, feel his pride in her, in their shared heritage of words, and she knew she could not remain silent. Some things were not for sale. Her father's legacy was not for sale. Her dignity was not on the menu. She took one slow, deliberate breath, the world around her, the clinking of silver, the murmur of distant conversations, fading into a dull roar. There was only table 12, and the man who had just attempted to annihilate her soul. She turned. When Layla turned, the serene mask of the waitress was gone. In its place was the calm, focused intensity of a scholar. Her eyes, the color of dark honey, were not angry. They were alight with a formidable, ancient fire. She held the silence for a long, charged moment, letting the poison of Alistair Finch's words hang in the air, heavy and rancid. Dr. Vance watched her, his expression a mixture of apprehension and profound curiosity. Alistair himself looked momentarily confused, annoyed that the scenery had not yet moved on as commanded. Then she spoke. Her voice was not raised, but it possessed a resonant clarity that seemed to silence the entire corner of the restaurant. And the language she used was not the simple English of a Chicago waitress. It was a breathtakingly pure, classical Arabic, the fusha of poetry and academia. The accent was flawless, the cadence musical, the articulation as precise as the calligraphy her father so loved. "You say it, Finch," she began, her gaze locked directly onto his. "Oh, Mr. Finch." The formal address was itself a quiet rebuke. "Rayuk fodaka, mara kulli al-ihtiram, laisa lahu ayatu qma, inda rabbini matumant." Your opinion of my intelligence, with all due respect, has no value to me whatsoever. Alistair Finch's jaw dropped. The fork he was holding slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the china plate with a sharp crack that echoed in the sudden stillness. He stared at her as if a piece of furniture had just quoted Shakespeare. The shock on his face was total, a comical, if it weren't so pathetic tableau of disbelief and dawning, gut-churning horror. Layla did not give him a moment to recover. She had the floor, and she would not yield it. "Lakin wakahatuka la tuhanuni ana faqat," she continued, her tone gaining a sharp, crystalline edge. "Bal tuhanu hada al-mat'am, waltahi al-adri a'adda ta'amak, wadayfak, al-Dr. Vance, al-madmum ala tahammul adaika al-karih hada." However, your rudeness does not only insult me, but it insults this establishment, the chef who prepared your food, and your guest, Dr. Vance, who is forced to endure this unpleasant performance of yours. She shifted her gaze briefly to Dr. Vance, a flicker of acknowledgement for the quiet decency he had shown her before her eyes snapped back to Finch. She then took a half-step closer, her posture radiating a scholarly authority that his billions could not challenge. She was no longer a waitress, she was a teacher, and he was the failing student. She lowered her voice slightly, making the final strike more personal, more devastating. "Kala Shah Irun Azim Mara," she said, her voice now a soft, lethal whisper. "A great poet once said." She then quoted a famous line from Al-Mutanabi, a verse every educated Arab would know, a verse about the difference between true strength and loud, empty posturing. "Idha ra'aita nuyub al-laythi barizatan, fala tazunnana ana al-laytha yaptasimu." If you see the lion's teeth bared, do not think that the lion is smiling. The meaning was unmistakable. You mistook my professional patience for weakness. You were wrong. Finch's face had drained of all color, leaving a sickly, pale sheen under the restaurant's soft lighting. He looked as though she had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He was a man whose entire existence was predicated on control, on knowing every variable, on possessing superior information. And he had just been intellectually and culturally disemboweled by a woman he had dismissed as having a mind full of sand. She had not merely understood his insult, she had parried it with a weapon he didn't know existed, the profound weight of a culture he had only ever skimmed for profit. She had exposed him not just as a bore, but as an ignoramus, right in front of the very man he was desperately trying to impress with his power and sophistication. Dr. Elias Vance slowly, deliberately, placed his napkin on the table beside his plate. He looked from Finch's utterly shattered expression to Layla's dignified, unyielding stance. A slow smile of pure, unadulterated admiration spread across his face. He had just witnessed an act not of insubordination, but of breathtaking intellectual courage. The spell was shattered by Julian, the maitre d' scurrying over, his face a mask of pure terror. He had seen the commotion from across the room, the dropped fork, the stunned silence, Finch's ashen face. He saw only a career-ending catastrophe, a waitress provoking the most powerful and vindictive man in Chicago. "Is everything all right here, Mr. Finch?" Julian stammered, his eyes darting nervously between them. He shot a look of murderous fury at Layla. Alistair Finch didn't speak. He couldn't. Words seemed to have abandoned him. He just stared at Layla, his formidable brain short-circuiting as it tried to process the cataclysmic shift in power that had just occurred. Layla stood her ground, her chin high. She didn't look at Julian. Her focus remained entirely on the man she had just dismantled. She had said what needed to be said. She was prepared for the inevitable consequences. It was Dr. Vance who finally broke the silence, his voice calm, clear, and carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Everything is perfectly fine, Julian. This young lady was simply giving Mr. Finch a much-needed lesson in classical Arabic poetry. A fascinating one, at that." He turned his admiring gaze back to Layla. "Asanti, ya bint. Asanti jiddan. Well done, my girl. Very well done." The praise from a man of Dr. Vance's stature was a shield, but it was not enough to stop the guillotine. Julian, seeing only the ghost-white face of his billionaire patron, made the only calculation a terrified sycophant could: appease the power, eliminate the problem. "Miss Hassan," he said, his voice dropping to a low, cold snarl. "My office, now." Layla gave a single sharp nod. She turned from the table without a backward glance at Alistair Finch, her spine as straight and unbending as a spear. As she walked across the plush Aubusson carpet, she could feel the stares of the entire dining room. 100 conversations halted mid-sentence. She had become the floor show, but as she walked, she felt no shame. She felt a strange, terrifying, and exhilarating lightness. For the first time in years, she had not swallowed the poison. She had served it back to its maker. In Julian's cramped, over-decorated office, the execution was swift and merciless. "Are you certifiably insane?" he hissed the moment the door clicked shut. "Do you have any comprehension of who that was? That's Alistair Finch. He could buy this building, demolish it, and build a private dog park on this spot and not even notice the charge on his credit card. He could ruin me, you, this entire restaurant, with one phone call." "He insulted me, Julian," Layla said, her voice calm and steady, "and he insulted my heritage. He's Alistair Finch. He could insult the Queen of England to her face." Julian was practically vibrating with rage and fear. "I don't care if he said you were a three-headed alien from Mars. You smile, you nod, you ask if he wants his steak cooked a little more. That is the job." "No," Layla said, the strength she had found at the table holding fast. "That is not the job. The job is service. It is not servitude." Julian stopped his frantic pacing and glared at her, his face contorted in disbelief. "Get your things. You're fired. I want you off the premises in 5 minutes." "I understand," she replied. There was nothing more to be said. She changed out of her uniform in the sterile, fluorescent-lit staff locker room, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The other servers and kitchen staff gave her a wide berth, whispering in hushed tones. She saw a mixture of pity and a strange, fearful respect in their eyes. She had done the thing they all fantasized about, and now she was paying the price they all knew was inevitable. Stepping out of the grand, mahogany-trimmed entrance of Aurelia into the crisp Chicago night was a disorienting experience. The city's familiar skyline seemed alien, the traffic on Michigan Avenue louder, more aggressive. She was free, but she was also adrift. The lifeline had been severed. The ravenous beast of her father's medical bills was still waiting, and its food source was gone. Panic, sharp and icy, began to seep into the cracks of her righteous anger. What had she done? How could she have been so impulsive? She began to walk, Block after block, the city's relentless energy a cruel counterpoint to the hollow dread expanding in her chest. Her dignity was intact, but dignity couldn't pay for neurology consultations or physical therapy. Dignity couldn't keep her father in the one facility that knew how to care for him. Back at table 12, the atmosphere was glacial. Dr. Vance was calmly sipping his water, observing Finch with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a newly discovered and highly volatile element. Alistair hadn't moved. He was still staring at the spot where Layla had stood, as if her ghost were burned into the air. "Well, Alistair," Dr. Vance said quietly, breaking the silence, "that was educational." Finch finally snapped back to the present, a dark, unfamiliar flush of shame creeping up his neck. He, Alistair Finch, had been publicly eviscerated. Not by a corporate rival, not by a hostile journalist, but by a waitress. And the worst part, the part that twisted in his gut like a shard of glass, was that she had been magnificent. Her command of the language, her courage, her quiet fury, it was the most powerful thing he had witnessed in years. He stood abruptly, tossing his linen napkin onto his barely touched steak. "The deal for the museum is off, Elias. I'm withdrawing my offer." Dr. Vance raised a silver eyebrow, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "Oh, was there a deal? I was under the impression you were making a demand. Perhaps you've lost your appetite for philanthropy?" Finch ignored the barb. He scanned the dining room, his eyes landing on the maitre d's station. "Where is she?" he demanded of Julian, who had scurried back to the table, wringing his hands. "She has been terminated, Mr. Finch," Julian said, desperate to placate him. "Her behavior was a disgrace. I offer you my most profound apologies on behalf of Aurelia." Finch stared at Julian, and his expression curdled into one of pure, undiluted contempt. "You fired her?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "You fired her because she had the courage to defend herself from my appalling behavior." He took a step closer to the trembling maître d'. "You're a coward." Without another word, he turned and strode out of the restaurant, leaving Dr. Vance and a bewildered Julian in his wake. He hit the cool night air and looked up and down the street, a strange urgency gripping him. But Layla was gone, absorbed into the vast, indifferent fabric of the city. He was alone with a feeling he hadn't known since he was a powerless child, a deep, soul-crushing shame, and something else, something new and profoundly unsettling, an obsessive, burning need to find the woman who had held up a mirror and shown him a barbarian. For 3 days, Layla operated in a haze of controlled panic. She spent her mornings at her father's bedside, reading to him from his favorite collections of Arabic poetry, her voice a steady balm she did not feel herself. She spent her afternoons at the university library, using the public computers to scour online job boards, applying for anything and everything, from barista positions at campus coffee shops to hostess jobs at mid-range bistros. The world of fine dining, she knew, was closed to her. Word of the incident at Aurelia would travel fast. A quick call to Julian for a reference would be all it took to have her application deleted. The fear was a constant, physical presence, a cold weight in her chest. Every email notification made her jump, hoping for an interview, dreading a message from the Institute's billing department. Meanwhile, in a sterile penthouse office overlooking the Chicago River, Alistair Finch was waging a campaign. He had assigned his top corporate intelligence team, the same ruthless analysts he used to dig up compromising information on rival CEOs, a new singular directive: find Layla Hassan. He gave them her name, her last known workplace, and a deadline. "I want everything," he had snarled at his head of security. "Where she lives, where she studies, her family, her bank statements, what brand of toothpaste she uses. I want to know what makes her breathe. And you will be invisible. If she knows she's being watched, you're all fired." The task was proving to be more challenging than they'd expected. She lived a quiet, almost ascetic life. She had no social media presence, no credit card debt, no digital breadcrumbs to follow beyond her university enrollment. The second front of Finch's war was internal, and it was far more savage. Her words, spoken in that beautiful, devastating Arabic, played on a loop in his mind. "Fatat al-Badia, Akliha Ramel. If you see the lion's teeth bared." He, who prided himself on his icy control, had been exposed as a common bully. His cruelty, usually a calculated tool of negotiation, had been revealed as nothing more than petty, pointless sadism. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something beyond his own wounded ego. He started to wonder about the father she'd mentioned, the reason for her grueling job. The file his team eventually produced was thin, but what it contained hit him with the force of a body blow. Dr. Omar Hassan. The name was vaguely familiar. Finch had his team dig deeper. He found articles, academic papers, a biography of a brilliant mind celebrated for his work in preserving a culture Finch had only ever viewed as a source of oil and investment capital. And he found the medical records: ischemic stroke, severe aphasia, prognosis guarded. He saw the astronomical monthly bills from the Lakeshore Neurological Institute, and he understood. Her servitude had not been for herself. It had been an act of desperate, profound love. On the fourth day, Layla's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Bracing herself for a rejection, she answered. "Am I speaking with Miss Layla Hassan?" a man's voice asked. It was the warm, cultured baritone she remembered from that terrible night. "This is she," Layla answered, her guard immediately up. "My name is Elias Vance. We met briefly at Aurelia." Layla's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why was he calling? Was he calling on Finch's behalf? To threaten her? "Dr. Vance, yes, I remember," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "First, I wanted to extend a formal apology for the events of that evening. Mr. Finch's conduct was beneath contempt." "Thank you, sir. That's not necessary." "On the contrary, it is entirely necessary," he corrected her gently. "I also wanted to tell you that I was utterly captivated, not just by your courage, but by your command of the language. To quote al-Mutanabi in that context, it was a masterstroke of rhetoric. My father was a professor of classical literature. He would have been delighted." Layla was silent, bewildered. "I am the chief curator at the Field Museum," Dr. Vance continued. "We have recently acquired a collection of early Andalusian manuscripts, and frankly, my current staff lacks the specialized paleographic skills to properly catalog them. It requires a deep, nuanced understanding of both Kufic and Maghribi scripts. It requires a scholar." The implication hung in the air, shimmering and unbelievable. "Dr. Vance, I was a waitress," she stammered. "I'm a graduate student." "You are a woman who intellectually disarmed Alistair Finch with a 10th century couplet," he replied, a note of amusement in his voice. "That, Miss Hassan, is a more impressive line on a resume than a degree from Harvard Business School. I'm not offering you a job waiting tables. I am offering you a research fellowship, a paid one. The stipend should be more than sufficient to ensure you no longer have to concern yourself with your father's expenses, and you will be working with materials that will be invaluable to your dissertation." Tears, hot and sudden, pricked at Layla's eyes. It was a lifeline, thrown from the most impossible quarter. It was not just a job. It was a validation. It was a return to her world, the world of her father. "Yes," she breathed, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Dr. Vance, I would be very, very interested." 2 days later, Layla sat in a quiet, sunlit office in the museum's restricted research wing, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and bookbinding glue. She had just signed a contract for the Elias Vance Fellowship in Semitic Philology. The stipend was generous beyond her wildest dreams. At that exact moment across the city, Alistair Finch was staring at a single sheet of paper on his desk. It was an internal memo from his intelligence team. It detailed Layla's new position at the museum, personally funded by Dr. Elias Vance. Finch felt a surge of a complex alien emotion. It was a bitter cocktail of fury, frustration, and a strange, searing jealousy. Vance had beaten him to it. He had found her, and with a single elegant move, had not only rescued her, but had placed her in a position of intellectual prestige. She was no longer a waitress he could find and attempt to salve his conscience with a large vulgar check. She was now a respected scholar under the protection of a man he had failed to intimidate. The game had not ended. It had just been elevated to a level he didn't know how to play. The transition from the clatter of the restaurant to the hallowed silence of the museum was like stepping into another dimension. Layla traded her linen apron for archival gloves, the scent of truffle oil for the dry, sweet fragrance of ancient parchment. Her initial role was to catalog the newly acquired manuscripts, but Dr. Vance, a shrewd mentor, quickly recognized the depth of her intellect. She didn't just read the texts, she understood their context, their history, the subtle theological debates hidden within the glosses in the margins. She blossomed. For the first time in over a year, she was being valued for her mind, her true self, not for her ability to remain silent in the face of abuse. The work was embalmed to her soul, and the fellowship stipend lifted the crushing financial weight that had burdened her for so long. She could finally pay her father's medical bills without a tremor of fear, even hiring a private speech therapist to supplement his care at the institute. She felt, for the first time since his stroke, a flicker of hope. She saw nothing of Alistair Finch. His name, once a source of terror, faded into the background noise of the city's financial news. The museum board, she learned, had politely but firmly rejected his proposal for the Finch technology wing. He had, it seemed, moved on to other conquests. But Finch had not moved on. He had become obsessed. His failure to best Layla and Vance's subsequent trumping of him had lodged in his mind like a piece of shrapnel. His initial impulse to find her and apologize, or more accurately, to make a grand gesture that would reestablish his dominance, had morphed into something far more complex. He began to shadow her life from a distance, using his vast resources not to intimidate, but to understand. His investigators, now tasked with a long-term, low-profile surveillance, reported on her daily routine: the museum, the hospital, her small apartment. They compiled a detailed dossier on Dr. Omar Hassan's condition. Finch, a man who devoured corporate financials for breakfast, found himself reading dense medical journals on neurorehabilitation and experimental stroke treatments. He learned about the subtle signs of progress, the plateaus, the crushing setbacks. He was studying the battlefield of her life with the same intensity he would apply to a hostile takeover. Then the strange, inexplicable ripples began. The first was a call to Layla from the director of the Lakeshore Institute. An anonymous benefactor, he explained, had just endowed a new research wing for experimental aphasia therapies. As part of the endowment, a fund was established to cover the full cost of care for 5 current patients who met a specific neurological profile. Her father, the director said, his voice full of excitement, was the first to qualify. His bills from that day forward would be covered in their entirety. Layla was stunned into silence, a cold suspicion mingling with her overwhelming relief. Anonymous benefactors didn't just appear out of nowhere. She spoke to Dr. Vance, who assured her it had nothing to do with him or the museum. "My dear Layla," he'd said, "our entire endowment wouldn't cover a wing like that. This is the work of a titan." A month later, a second ripple. A package arrived at the museum for her, forwarded from her old department at the university. It was from a colleague of her father's in Jordan. Inside was a copy of a newly published, lavishly illustrated book, The Collected Works of Omar Hassan. It was a beautiful, comprehensive volume of her father's life's work. Essays, photographs of his calligraphic analyses, translations. It was a legacy project her father had dreamed of, but had never had the funding to complete. A small note inside from the publisher explained that an anonymous grant from a newly established Foundation for Middle Eastern Heritage had made the publication possible. Layla held the heavy book in her hands, her heart pounding. This was too specific, too personal. It was an act of restoration, a resurrection of her father's voice. The final, undeniable piece of the puzzle fell into place on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Layla was in her father's room at the institute, watching as his new speech therapist, a brilliant young woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, guided him through a set of exercises. Dr. Sharma was a rising star in her field, recently recruited from Johns Hopkins. "His progress is remarkable, Layla," Dr. Sharma said, her eyes shining with professional pride. "The new transcranial magnetic stimulation therapy we're pioneering here is showing incredible results with him." "The new therapy?" Layla asked. "I thought that was still in early trials." Dr. Sharma smiled. "It was, but our new research wing came with a hefty equipment grant and the funding to accelerate the FDA approval process. Our benefactor was very specific about the technology he wanted us to acquire. He'd clearly done his research. She paused, then added, "It's strange. The foundation that arranged all this, Finch Equity Partners, handled the endowment." The name hit Layla like a physical impact. Finch, Alistair Finch, the research wing, the fellowship for her father's care, the book, it was all him. This wasn't a clumsy apology. It was a silent, meticulously engineered campaign of restitution. He hadn't just thrown money at the problem. He had studied it, understood it, and deployed his immense resources with surgical precision to fix the specific things he had broken. Not for her, but for her father. He was rebalancing the scales of justice in the only way he knew how, with overwhelming strategic force. The anger and fear she had associated with his name began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and unsettling confusion. The next morning she did not call. She took the L train to the Loop, walked into the cavernous marble and steel lobby of the Finch Equity Tower, and announced herself to the receptionist. "I'm here to see Alistair Finch. My name is Layla Hassan." The woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The name clearly meant something. "Do you have an appointment?" "He'll see me," Layla said with a certainty that surprised even herself. She was right. Within minutes, she was being escorted into a silent, high-speed elevator that opened directly into his penthouse office. It was less an office than a kingdom, a vast space enclosed by walls of glass that offered a god's-eye view of Chicago and Lake Michigan. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the winter sky. He turned as she entered, and the man she saw was not the predator from the restaurant. The arrogance, the cruel certainty, it was gone. In its place was a quiet, weary tension. He looked haunted. "Layla," he said. Her name was a statement, not a question. "It was you," she said, her voice shaking just slightly. "All of it. The Institute. The book." It was an accusation, but it held no heat. He didn't deny it. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes." "Why?" He took a step away from the window, into the room's soft light. "That night, after I left the restaurant, your words, the poem, it was like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was there. I'd spent my entire life believing that language was a tool for contracts and commands. You showed me it was a soul." He gestured to a chair, but she remained standing. He didn't press, instead keeping a respectful distance. "I had my team look into you. At first it was about reasserting control, finding a weakness. But then I found your father. I read about his work, I saw the bills, and I understood that my casual cruelty hadn't just been an insult to you. It was an insult to a lifetime of scholarship, of love, of devotion. It was an insult to everything he represented." He walked over to his massive empty desk and picked up a book. It was a copy of the collected works of Omar Hassan. "I started reading this," he said, his voice low. "I didn't understand most of the technical aspects, but I understood the passion. I understood what was being lost while he was trapped in silence. My business is acquisition. I take things, I strip them, I make them more efficient. But I have never in my entire life actually built anything. I've never restored anything. I wanted to see what it felt like." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of profound vulnerability in his cold blue eyes. "I couldn't fix what I did to you. Words of apology from me would be worthless. They are the one currency I don't know how to use properly. So I decided to fix what I could. I rebalanced the ledger. I couldn't give your father back his voice, but I could give him the best chance to find it again. I could ensure his legacy was preserved." He placed the book back on the desk with a quiet finality. "I didn't do it for your forgiveness, Layla. I don't think I've earned that. I did it because you showed me the vast, empty poverty of my wealth. You have something that can't be bought. I just wanted to pay for the damages." Layla stood in the profound silence of his office, the city sprawling beneath them. She looked at this powerful, broken man who had tried to crush her and who had then, with the same relentless, obsessive focus, dedicated himself to rebuilding her world. The hatred she had nurtured for him had withered away, leaving behind a raw, complex and deeply human ache. "My father," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears, "always taught me that the truest measure of a person is not the mistakes they make, but what they do to mend them." A fragile, desperate hope flickered in Alistair Finch's eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak, as if a single breath might shatter the moment. He was no longer a titan of industry, a corporate predator. He was just a man, standing before a woman, asking not for forgiveness, but for a simple acknowledgement that his attempt at mending had been seen. And as Layla looked out at the vast, endless horizon of the lake, she realized that her own world, once so precarious and small, had just expanded in ways she could never have imagined. What lay ahead was an unknown, uncharted territory. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid. And that's where their story truly begins. Not with the clang of a dropped fork, but with the quiet turning of a page. A powerful lesson that true strength is not the power to insult, but the courage to understand. And that sometimes the most profound apologies are not spoken, but built, one restored piece of a shattered world at a time.